The Democratic Alliance is calling for a state of disaster to be declared over Eskom and electricity as a whole. It's taken steps to have the issue placed on the agenda of the next cabinet meeting. The party says South Africa's 15-year load-shedding crisis requires the whole of society approach. Let's speak now to the DA spokesperson on trade, industry and economic development, Matt Cuthbert, who joins us from Cape Town, as you can see by his backdrop. Matt, thanks for your time this evening. This call coming from the DA, not a surprise really. From a realistic and practical point of view, what would be needed for a state of disaster of this kind to be declared? Because it would be quite a big state of disaster, wouldn't it, for the, if you look at the size of the problem at hand?
Evening, Marcel, and thanks very much for having me on your show. Your content producer said that we were going to be speaking about our task team that we've formed to combat the theft of public infrastructure. So this is a little bit unbeknown to me, but I would like to speak to the issue that I was told I'm being interviewed about. And
okay, Matt, if I could perhaps then just cut in there, my apologies. It looks like there was some cross-purposes discussion and miscommunication as it is in this ongoing news cycle that we find ourselves in. So I do hope you understand. Some of it does speak to each other, though, doesn't it? We have had a focus throughout today on the crisis of infrastructure in South Africa. A lot of it not new to many of us. I mean, if I look at just some of the stories my colleagues filed today. Thousands of residents in Giyani and surrounding Limpopo without basic needs, especially water. Underspending on maintenance is crippling infrastructure and service delivery in municipalities. Then there's a story that looks at the Soweto highway that's got a sunken road and a hole under a transformer in a North Riding area. The list goes on. You've got a task team that is focused on the issue of theft, which speaks to a lot of those stories as well. Why have you decided to focus on theft specifically? Do you think it is because the infrastructure crisis is so big? There's that saying about how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time, and theft is that one bite.
Yeah, so certainly, I think it's a crisis, as you've stated, and I think it's something that's become, prevalent, particularly during the COVID period. And the fact is that our economy, on average, loses about 187 billion rand due to infrastructure theft. Big state-owned entities such as Transnet, Eskom, in parts Telkom and PRASA have confirmed this. And, it's really a law enforcement problem, despite what many ministers, have said over the last week or so. I mean, we've had Minister Gordhan and Minister Mbalula say that we should ban the export of scrap metal, and we believe that that's a rather lazy measure, because that takes away the accountability that government needs to make sure that they have proper law enforcement processes in place so that people aren't, lifting our infrastructure and further damaging our economy. And that's why we set up this task team with all our relevant shadow ministers to try and put a proactive plan together of national, provincial and local interventions that we believe will work in the long run and help us stem the tide that we're currently facing. Because if we fail to protect our infrastructure, we fail to protect our economy.
And I see the list of interventions here are quite practical, but how would you go about having it implemented other than in municipalities where you are indeed in control of the resources and the purse strings?
So, I mean, from a national level, we are able to put on pressure on the relevant ministers. And we've asked all of our shadow ministers in this particular cluster to write to the ministers, say, these are the proposals that we are putting forward. Can you please cost them and include them in your budgeting plans? I think that's the role of a constructive opposition, and that's what we're trying to do on that front. We obviously govern a province, so there's a certain amount of interventions that a province can take, and we are interacting with our provincial authorities in the Western Cape to get them to try and roll out these particular interventions. And then obviously we govern almost 36 municipalities across the country. And whilst there's been some good work done thus far, particularly in the case of Joburg, we'd like to see this more widely spread across the metros where we govern. And we're hoping that if we're able to set that particular example, that we can share this best practice with other municipalities, that are governed by other political parties. At the end of the day, we all lose if we don't protect our infrastructure. And I think that's the chief point we're trying to get across.
You've also focused quite a bit on the industry, I suppose you could call it, around scrap dealing. And one of the things you've mentioned here in terms of an intervention is the eradicating of the backlog of scrap dealer licenses. Talk to us about why that specifically you believe is an intervention that might be able to help.
For sure. So, I mean, there's a lot of people who don't operate legally. I mean, there are a lot of people who do operate legally, but there's people who don't operate legally. And sometimes, compliance and red tape to get these kinds of licenses in order to comply, as with many other things and many other forms of bureaucratic red tape, have been a real challenge. So that's why we identified that particularly as an issue, to make sure that we regularize scrap dealers, and then we can obviously have associated interventions to make sure that when they are in business and registered to be in business, that they do it accordingly. I think it also brings into place a broader, argument about scrap metal. And there's a big argument from, upstream steel producers to say we need this export ban because, our infrastructure is being lifted. But, I had a conversation with the stakeholder earlier today. It's pretty difficult to go and lift, 26 kilometers of Transnet railway. So you've got to think that there's some sort of special interest group at play here, and we don't necessarily buy that argument. And it's also an indication that, government's moving towards more of a command control, type of arrangement. And, that's why it gets our backs up. And we think that, once again, it's an enforcement issue. And we need to be very clear about the facts and, what the causes are of these issues.
I see you're also wanting to establish a reward hotline to try and encourage the community to get involved, to report criminal activities. Now, this is not a new approach, but you seem to think it would help. I mean, throughout our stories we've been telling today, with our focus on the infrastructure crisis, there has been a call for the community to get involved. And we have seen a lot of communities saying, you know what, if we're going to keep waiting for government to come and try and fix things, we're going to be waiting forever. And people are quite literally rolling up their sleeves. Are you hoping that that is the kind of approach you could get with regards to this specific fight of yours?
Certainly, I think you've hit the nail on the head. You need to have the community take ownership of the infrastructure. And I think it's important that people realize how important that infrastructure is, not only for their own lives, but for the broader, prosperity of their communities. And I think it's important to hold, criminals in our communities to account. And I believe by setting up a rewards hotline and incentivizing people to phone in, give tip-offs and the rest of it, it also helps law enforcement with better information so that they're able to track these people down and ensure that they're arrested and then handed over to the relevant prosecuting authorities. And I think it's about making sure people are engaged, because you've seen many instances where, local vigilantes will go and burn down schools, they'll, pilfer certain infrastructure, and communities, once the police go in there, say, well, we're not sure who it was. And often that's, due to fear, community pressures, and we want to try and alleviate that, because we don't want somebody who's trying to do a good thing to get into trouble merely for sharing information that really needs to be acted on.
Just finally, before I let you go, I mean, it's all well and good that we try and get the community involved, but again, one of the other things we've seen, a golden thread through many of our stories today, is a lot of community members have just given up, and they've said, you know what, I've tried to go the route of speaking to a counsellor, I've tried to complain, I don't hear anything. Many of our communities, perhaps from a resources point of view, they don't have access, they can't tweet somebody, they can't march up to somebody's door and explain what their issue is, or demand certain things and write harshly worded emails to people and that kind of thing, and they feel disenfranchised. How do you approach that in terms of trying to get people on your side in this fight?
So I think that's a very important question, and I think it extends beyond, writing angry letters, reporting to a reward hotline. I think that it's important that law enforcement sets up information sharing networks in their communities. They know who the scrap dealers are. Generally, people have a fairly good idea of, who's committing crimes and the rest of it. I think that we often, underestimate the close nature of our communities and how much people do interact with one another. And I think it's about building up that relationship with local communities, local politicians, leadership, as well as the law enforcement authorities, to make sure that there's a holistic approach to clamping down on this kind of thing. And I think, there's many examples of, and I'll use a relatively common example, but there's, good cooperation on the CPF front in particular, and there's nothing to say that we can't use those existing relationships to work with the industry stakeholders in the area to make sure that communities are feeding that information through to law enforcement. And, at the end of the day, making sure that communities actually get justice. And I think that's the most important thing. And I think we often have a very cynical view of how the world works, but I think it just takes the initiative to actually go out there and make sure that we make those ties, that we keep people informed, and that we actually, as public representatives in particular, allow ourselves to be held accountable by our communities.